Hello, and thank you for attending. This is a webinar from VirtuLab on SBIR and STTR and other federal funding for life science startups. And it's part of the AOBio series being offered by Angel Oregon for life science startups in the Oregon and the Northwest ecosystem. My name is Leon Wolf, and I'm the Federal Funding Assistance Manager at VirtuLab, which is headquartered in Oregon and serves the Northwest. So today I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes on some SBIR basics, as well as some of the agencies that provide funding for life science. Then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'm happy to take questions both in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute if you do have questions. So again, my name is Leon Wolf. I've been doing SBIR and STTR grants for about 10 years now, mostly focused on climate change and clean tech and clean energy in the Oregon ecosystem. But VirtuLab provides free support to companies seeking this type of funding for all industries and all technologies. So please don't hesitate to contact us with the contact info I'll give at the end of this presentation. So I'm here today to tell you about some important funding for the life science or medical technology you may be developing, even if you're just a researcher or a very early stage entrepreneur that hasn't even formed a company. But once you do form a company, you're going to need cash. You're going to need money to hire people, do experiments, rent facilities, and do a whole bunch of other things to get ready to go to market. SBIR and STTR is an important source of funding to help you do that. It stands for Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer. This is really a pair of programs managed under one roof at a number of different federal agencies that now offer over $4 billion annually of research and development grants or contracts to small businesses that are developing a technology that's really one step beyond the basic research phase at a university, but still not ready for investment by the private sector or by a venture capitalist. So very often this stage is called the seed stage, and the SBA is branding SBIR and STTR grants as America's Seed Fund. And there's a whole ton of information and tutorials in which you can learn more about the programs themselves at the URL listed on this slide. But the important thing to know is that this is essentially a bridge grant to get something out of sort of the basic stage, basic research stage if it's at a university, or just the concept phase or preliminary proof of concept phase if not, and then move it out of the lab to scale it up, prove its feasibility, and get it ready for commercialization and for investment by the private sector. And the US government is doing this to grow high value, high innovation jobs in the US with good taxpayer revenue to get a return on investment for what it provides here, as well as to keep the US competitive both economically and technologically on the global scale. So again, this is kind of a seed grant. It's best to think of it as a hybrid of a business pitch and a technical research proposal. And it's often the only source of funding for an early stage startup, and it doesn't dilute the value of the company. So I mentioned that $4 billion, that's spread out across 12 different participating agencies, 11 or 12, depending on how you count Department of Commerce. Most of that money is in the top 5 listed here on this slide, and we'll talk about 2 of those top 5. One of them, the National Institutes of Health, has that $1.21 billion red slice of pie there on the right. And I'll tell you in a little while why I sometimes refer to it as NIH and sometimes it's HHS, which is Health and Human Services. Those top 5 agencies listed in bold here in the blue constitute essentially 98% of all the funding shown in this pie chart. And they also have STTR programs where you have to have some degree of formal monetary collaboration with a research institution like OSU or OHSU in the form of a subcontract. So that's a really good option if you're spinning out a university technology or you want to use the labs or analytical equipment at one of those universities. But it's not required for the rest of SBIRs, although it is allowed to a limited extent for up to 30% of the budget. So anyway, you can see there's quite a lot of money in play. There's also money at DoD, although not a lot of that is medical. It's almost $2 billion annually. And then again, all the money smeared out amongst the other agencies, and most of those don't really have much life science unless you're very specific on something that relates to the mission of that agency. The money is generally given out in two phases, $100,000 to $200,000 in what's called a phase one and $1 million in phase two. Everybody should really be thinking about a unified product development plan that gets you both of that money, all of that money. Don't stop at the small grant. And there are, particularly for life science, there is an option to switch, to skip that phase one and go straight to phase two if you're really, really tight with the agency and are really confident you've already demonstrated feasibility. But generally everyone starts at phase one, which is to show the fundamental, in the application you intend to commercialize, show the feasibility of what the invention you're talking about is. If it's, I'll talk a little bit later with NIH, but they do have what they call a fast track or a direct to phase two. And there you'd really be starting with a proven technology, but one that still needs some product or prototype development and considerably more testing and user validation. And then phase three is generally discussed under SBIR programs, but not funded. It essentially means commercialization and scaling activities. Some of the larger agencies do provide some consulting and matchmaking to both funders and customers in that phase. And again, it's really only the large agencies. So this kind of funding, I'm pleased to say, especially given how many people at the AOBio event are living proof that you can get this kind of funding, and it is achievable. It is useful types of funding. So in Oregon alone, there's dozens of life science awardees, including ones that spoke at the AOBio event. Rewire Neuroscience was one of them. There's so many on this slide, it takes a while to page through now. Medora, Holly Rockweiler was another. Hemix Health, Patty White was another success story. Neuromedica wasn't there, but Rachel Dreilinger is just a great person and a great innovator, has received funding from both NIH and NSF. Aranara, Eric Tucker, who was on the call 2 weeks ago and is the CEO of Aranara. Eric talked about his experience with NSF and NIH. And there's many, many more, both located at OBI, some are a little bit already in the distant past. Hemix, you went with Patty, Gamma Therapeutics, and the list goes on and on. So if you know any of these folks, I strongly recommend that you contact them and just kind of chat about what their history was, what their experiences and tips and tricks that they have. And if they're really good friends, they may be willing to share their proposal in the reviewer comments to help you in your journey to get this same type of funding. So I guess that's about all I want to say on life science awardees. And again, please, you know, even if you don't know any of these folks, take a look at some of their grants, take a look at their websites, and you may want to benchmark yourself about how closely your technology relates to what the agencies funded for these awardees to see if you're in the ballpark of what's a fundable project. All right, so this is kind of the end of part one. I just wanted to, I know I'm throwing a lot of information out, but I just wanted to put up there that both VirtuLab and other resources in Oregon are here to help. And VirtuLab provides free assistance at no cost, not just to our core competency in clean tech, but all other industries as well. And I've had a lot of experience, including with some of those companies on the slide I just showed you about in getting life science funding. This is provided free of charge because we have a grant from the U.S. Small Business Administration, and we do various forms of assistance, including one-on-one consulting, detailed training and workshops. Both myself and another contractor provide grant writing, and this covers technical preparation, all of the nuts and bolts of SBIR registrations and submission mechanics and required documents, and also some expertise, both from me and our entrepreneur in residence, on planning your commercialization approach. And also, I'm sure a lot of the educational resources at OEN and some of the programs offered by their partners may provide some of that pitch coaching as well. So kind of takes a village to grow a startup, and you should be considering all possible resources. In addition to the free support from VirtuLab, you should go to our website listed here on this slide to either apply or look at some more short videos we have. And then we have a pretty easy to fill out application, as well as a better description of our services. In addition to what VirtuLab offers, Business Oregon provides a $5,000 kind of hands-off subsidy if you want to hire a grant writer or do something else to help with your phase 1 proposal. And if you do get a phase 1 or 2, they can actually provide a matching grant through a competitive process. It's $50,000 on top of that $200,000 or so phase 1. So it's definitely worth applying for. And many of you are probably already involved in some of these programs, but I just wanted to give a quick shout to Oak Tree, the OHSU Clinical Translational Research Institute, which has what's called the Biomedical Innovation Program. They also have a related phase 0 program to help with subsidizing SBIR grants. They have, although I'm not sure how current it is, a structured program of helping prepare and review and critique an NIH proposal. And then of course, Oregon Bioscience Incubator, OBI, also has mentorship and a number of resources to help you. And I'm sure some folks here today are probably familiar with OBI. So that was kind of the end of my pitch on SBIR basics. And again, if you joined not through AOBio or don't have a life science background, you may find the rest of this a little bit too specific and dense, but feel free to stick around. So I'm going to go into the top 2 things on this slide only. Funding opportunities for medical and life science startups at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, as well as the National Science Foundation, which are the 2 biggest buckets of money for these types of technologies. The Department of Defense also has a lot more money, but they spend most of it on guns, armor, and bombs. So only some of it is intended to fix the people who get hit by guns or bombs. But some of that comes in the form of cooperative agreements working with some of the hospitals, both for active duty people as well as VA or post-discharge related medical conditions such as PTSD or some of the other conditions that are prevalent in the VA community. So that's all spread out across the main 3 services, Army, Air Force, and Navy. And topics are usually very specific to those. I'm not going to say too much more here. There's also an agency that's very specifically tasked with cross-cutting military health issues. That's called DHA. They're a much smaller component, but they do have 100% of their budget does go to specific SBIR projects for health-related issues in the military. And then there's something called the CDMRP. I won't talk about too much or anymore today unless there's questions, but there's some very explicit programs in collaboration with some of the Army or Navy hospitals where they're doing specific cross-cutting research to help all the services with some existing issues. And then a non-SBIR program that's gotten a lot of funding recently because of COVID is called BARDA. I forget, it's sort of Biological Advanced Research and Development Agency. They're more concerned with public health and ambulatory response things, but they do have a research budget, and they do have a lot of funding for things like solving sepsis and other more public and clinical health related issues. So again, I'm just going to talk next about the top 2 things on here, and this is really where I think most of you are interested and will find the most chance of success in applying for SBIR funding for your startup. And of course, the National Institutes of Health is probably no secret to most of you, and most of the people on the previous slide had luck with NIH. They have the largest healthcare budget and the second largest agency. As I said, it's $1.2 billion. And most of that money is given out in the form of grants, although some, once a year, they issue also a contract solicitation for some very specific things they're looking for. And actually, it's a good opportunity. It's less competitive than a lot of the grants. So I'd urge people to consider both grants and contracts at NIH. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with NIH, a quick bit of background is that there's a reason why it's called the National Institutes. There are actually 23 institutes, most of which focus on a single area of healthcare or life science, and usually a specific healthcare issue or disease pathology like cancer, heart, lung, and blood diseases, or aging-related issues. The reason why I call it sometimes HHS instead of NIH is that there are several agencies outside of NIH, notably the CDC that's in the news so much, and the FDA, and something called the Association or the Agency for Administration for Community Living, which has some great funding for disability-related technologies that make the lives of those who suffer from disabilities a little better, as well as preventing some of those issues in the first place. So those are part of the larger Health and Human Services Department, but not part of NIH, but they tend to work as one unit with some nuances that are a little different. So at NIH, like I said, it's a little bit of an alphabet soup for all the different institutes. And I won't tell you what most of these acronyms are, but you can see the biggest ones in the pie slices on the right are NCI, which is National Cancer Institute, NIAID, which is Tony Fauci's group, National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. That's been in the news so much lately, Heart, Lung, and Blood. And the one relatively cross-cutting institute that concerns itself with surgical, analytical, and some diagnostic things, clinical trial technologies and other things is NIGMS, General Medical Science. So it's not absolutely critical to zero in on the right institute when you're applying to NIH, but it helps a lot, both from the point of view of giving you the best odds of success and also helping you design your proposal so it's geared towards the needs of that particular institute. So again, this is still a high-level overview talking about how to explicitly and in detail prepare a proposal to NIH. Would take most of a 3-hour workshop and probably longer if it was with hands-on homework. We don't have time for that today, but if you're really, really interested, I believe that every couple of years, OBI, Oak Tree, and sometimes OBA jointly participate in a more detailed NIH workshop for people who know they're writing an SBIR grant. So get in touch with Heather or Melissa Mudd or Jonathan or Lisa at OBA, or I think Amanda may also be able to help you navigate what's going on in life science for supporting startups. So some details that you do want to know when considering NIH is that they release most of their funding in one grand unified solicitation that they call the omnibus solicitation. It comes out once per year, but then they have 3 due dates with no changes in the procedures or the topics that are fundable or the institutes that are participating in that omnibus solicitation. There are some more specific targeted funding opportunities open, and these are listed on the NIH SBIR website. These would now have much less funding and also much fewer people applying and different procedures for what they're looking for, although SBIR basics are the same. So you want to go to the NIH website if there's something you're doing that you think is so specific that you want to basically really target a given institute and a given life science issue. NIH, as I mentioned earlier, has what's called a fast track, which is where you apply for phase 1 and phase 2 in one big batch. It's a lot of work. It's basically preparing 2 proposals at once. And the odds are fairly low. I would say 95% of NIH funding does not go to fast tracks or direct to phase 2s. And as direct to phase 2, as the name implies, that's basically skipping the phase 1 and going straight to phase 2. In both these cases, I strongly recommend you get both the recommendation and permission and instruction of how to do this directly from the program manager for that particular institute you're applying. I've seen a lot of overconfident people who are just like, we're ready, we're going to apply, and they don't even contact NIH. And especially for a fast track, what they do is they review your phase 1. If it's competitive, then they'll go on and review your phase 2 research plan and commercialization plan. But if your phase 1 isn't even accepted, they don't even look at your phase 2 application, and so you wasted a lot of time. So definitely contact the program manager. NIH, of course, recognizes that it's a long process and requires a lot of regulatory and testing prior to approval to go to market. So they allow clinical trials, and they have a lot of protocol to provide protection, human subjects protection, and decide whether or not what you're proposing is indeed a clinical trial. And I mentioned the contract solicitation earlier. So again, most of the funding at NIH is in this omnibus solicitation. This is on the next slide now, and this slide deck will be available both for attendees here and anyone else who asks Amanda. This solicitation includes, like I said, nearly all the institutes that participate, plus CDC and the FDA. You can apply to both a clinical or a non-clinical track. They just get reviewed separately, and they're, I mentioned, open for deadlines 3 times a year, and those dates are listed here. So if you miss one deadline, chances are you'll get reviewed in the next batch. It's not critical like some of the other agencies where they only have something open once a year. Again, there's the URL, and there are 2 companion documents if you're going to get serious about looking at this. The solicitation itself actually just contains a lot of the rules and regulations, but there's a topic description document also at that website. That's really where the meat of describing what it is they're interested in funding is, lists the names of the program managers and the topic authors, and gives you lots more information about the funding limits and how to apply. And in addition to that, there's also an application instructions, which I think is it's currently up to Forms F, it's called, and make sure you look at that when you get ready to write. So many other things. I know I'm running a little bit over on time, but NIH has what they call a hard cap on their funding limit. That is, I think, $252,000 for a phase 1, but they've cleared with the SBA to exceed that hard cap by up to 15%, 50%. And so for a phase 1, you can get as much as $330,000, which is a pretty big chunk of change for a 6 to 12 month project. Again, contact the program manager. You pretty much need written permission to exceed the hard cap for a given topic, and not all the topics have exceptions. There's a pretty rigorous and fairly transparent review process. NIH uses what they call the Center for Scientific Review, and some of you may actually have been on non-SBIR study sections to review proposals. That's a good process to get on to understand what's in proposals and what the agencies or what NIH is looking for and what the reviewers talk about. You may also want to look at the list of study sections to see if there's one that's most closely aligned with what you plan to propose. And as I already kind of encouraged you, it's both okay and actually recommended that you contact the program manager listed in the topics document. I would recommend you prepare a 1-pager that's nominally going to be the first page of your proposal, called the specific aims, and just kind of shoot it to them with an email and say, we'd like to talk for 15 minutes to see if we're responsive and you're the right institute. And some managers are really responsive and will give great feedback. Others will just rubber stamp it, and some may not even contact you. So it's as varied as the number of people in the planet. So don't be discouraged if you get a kind of a boilerplate response. There's lots of resources at NIH to help with proposals and business development in general. There's a program called the Application Assistance Program, or AAP, that's driven mainly out of the National Cancer Institute. NIH also has a version of iCore to help researchers do customer discovery. And then there's something called technical and business assistance, which will supplement a grant that you need to request while you're applying. So I know that's a lot of info. I will be glad to answer questions about NIH. And again, this information will be available as a handout, as a PDF through Amanda after the presentation. Anybody in the chat want to say anything? Nope. Okay, come on guys, I'm getting lonely out here.
It's a ton of information. It's such a valuable service that you know
Thanks.
the ins and outs of how this thing works and can help people step through it.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I know it's a flood, and so I'm just hitting the high points, believe it or not. Like I said, OBI, when they're funded for it, very often offers a much more in-depth workshop. In fact, I'll give some information about our workshops, which are provided by the same person which Heather and Jen Fox used in the past. Anyway, to round out the data dump, this is a much shorter subject, but the National Science Foundation, which I have personally worked with a lot on all technologies and love to work with, they have a $200 million budget. Only about 10% of that is life science, but they don't have the specific institutes and research topics that NIH does. So if you have something that's really broad and doesn't fit NIH, I recommend looking at NSF. And if you have a cross-cutting technology in digital health, a biomedical device, some kind of approach to pharmaceuticals or other bioscience that's not covered by NIH, look at NSF. But the only downside is that they don't fund clinical trials. So I'll talk about a way that you can still have a project requiring clinical trials, but work with NSF as well. But really quick, if you are interested in NSF, either contact me or apply online at VirtuLab. But your first step is going to be very low overhead preparation of a 1,500 word-ish project pitch. In order to be invited to apply, they really accept just about anybody in the ballpark, and I bet all the people on this call will be accepted. And they turn it around in 2 weeks. So it's really good to get your foot in the door, contact the program manager, and know that you're on the right track before you spend dozens of hours on a proposal. And then once accepted, you get an invite that's good for 1 year. This is the sections of the project pitch. And again, this info is on the NSF website, and you'll get these slides, and I'm happy to talk with anyone about what's required for the project pitch offline. So you may be wondering, which one should you go for? NIH is going to be very, very focused on healthcare, and you really need an MD or a PhD researcher at like OHSU to be the main investigator on your project. If you have clinical trials and want those funded, you're going to have to go to NIH, and you really should be very tied to improving the healthcare outcomes or changing clinical practice for the things that those institutes care about, like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, lung problems. On the other hand, NSF, this is a relative difference, not an absolute, but NSF tends to fund things complementary to NIH, things that are much more technology and materials oriented, more like engineering projects. They don't allow clinical trials, so you can't really fund working with live people, or I think you can fund animal studies, but I'm not even sure about that. It's much better if you're cross-cutting, because NSF really likes to see game-changing innovations that are large platform plays. And again, digital health, devices, and materials are what they tend to fund. So I always tell people, why not apply to both and get double your money? The best thing to do is start developing your product, particularly if there's some fundamental materials, software, or engineering you have to do to kind of get to a working prototype. Use the NSF money for that, maybe get through phase 1 or even phase 2. And then once you've narrowed down your product, once you've got a beta version of your software or whatever it is you're doing, then you can really start focusing on doing the clinical trials and getting regulatory approval with funding from NIH. So it's often a twofer option, and I'm pretty sure that companies like Medora and Aranara have done this. I know for sure Medora started with an engineering approach with NSF and then moved on to NIH for some of their trials. So it's a really nice 1-2 punch. Many years ago, before I had any gray hair, NSF NSF and NIH used to collaborate and do what they called a bridge, where you could get an NSF phase 1 and an NIH phase 2. They don't do that anymore. A little more siloed now. So that's all the data dump I had. And again, I'm totally open for questions. We have an upcoming high-level SBIR event, free webinar on April 14th, again offered by this company that does the more in-depth NIH workshops as well. They're called BBC. We're paying and hosting them, paying for them. They'll spend about an hour going into even more detail than I did, but on a lot of other things I haven't covered, like the differences between SBIR and STTR, what the reviewers are looking for, how to register, how to do homework with the various agencies, especially if you're interested in ones I didn't talk about today. All we ask is that you register and give us your email, and you can attend this. It's open to people outside of Oregon, although I'm not sure anybody on the phone here today is outside of Oregon. And yeah, we'd love to have you. There's no limit on the number of people to attend this free webinar. Then specifically for companies that are already identified what they want to do and have a really well-defined project and want to apply in 2022, once you've attended that April 14th ABC session as a prerequisite, we will then invite you to attend our in-depth SBIR workshop series. You have to attend all 5 of these, except if there's any extenuating circumstances. And this particular workshop series, while it does stay fairly general on preparing a proposal, we'll often talk about the NSF process, and the June 8th date will talk very specifically about the NSF requirements and give tips and tricks there. So if anybody wants NIH, we'd absolutely love to have you apply. And this one is also free of charge, but it's going to be limited to the top 15 companies, with preference given to Oregon companies, but we are looking for Washington, Idaho, or Alaska as well.
I put a link in the chat too for you.
Thank you. I was wondering what those things in the chat were.
Yeah.
So, and finally, we have a great event, which we sort of, I think, were chatting about before we started the webinar. It's called the Badass Women Entrepreneur Event. Also, it's free, and we'd love to get some info about you if you give us that you were attending from this OEN event. Use this promo code OEN Badass. At this event, you'll hear from both successful women entrepreneurs, as well as women in the entrepreneurial ecosystem who have expertise in funding or other parts of the ecosystem. And then you'll also hear some from me, but not too much. So I think that's about it. I'm gonna stop staying in slideshow mode so I can see more, and I'll see what's in the chat. Okay, Amanda, okay, no questions. All right, I'm just gonna stop sharing then so I can see faces. Anybody on the phone have questions about NIH, SBIR in general, even what institute their technology might be a good match for? Hi, Greg. Hi, Mike.
I have a quick question. Thanks for that really nice talk. That was a helpful overview of kind of the transition from phase 1 to phase 2 to commercialization. So I'm currently looking to put together an STTR proposal. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I'm kind of struggling with is how much, so it'll be a phase 1 proposal, and I'm struggling a little bit to know how much to talk about kind of the grand plan with phase 2, or how much just to focus purely on the phase 1
yeah,
aspect.
Great question. So yeah, the summary would be, you've got to have the big picture of how you plan to get to market and what your overall goals are, even though you're focused on the phase 1 research. Is this, Mike, is this NIH or NSF?
NIH.
NIH, great. So the reason I ask is because NIH, as I said, recognizes that medical technologies often have a very long and tortuous path to market. Hope that doesn't psych you out. So their phase 1 requirements are really focused on the research and proving the feasibility. And they have what I would call a slightly lighter requirement for the proposal, and much less than NSF in terms of the commercialization plan. So while you might want to put a couple of sentences like at the end of the proposal saying, once we have demonstrated feasibility of X, Y, and Z, this will lay the foundation for phase 2, in which we'll do a more fully integrated set of testing or move from the lab scale to the pilot scale, you know, whatever it is. You just want to show them that you're thinking of the future, but you don't have like 2 pages on your research objectives for phase 2, or, I mean, you have to talk about what your finished product is going to be and what its significance for healthcare outcomes and clinical practice would be if it is a clinical related technology. So that, you know, you are addressing the long-term view in the proposal in some of the sections, but you really don't have to have much detail beyond phase 1, either for research, the product development, neither the product development nor the commercialization activity. NIH will look for that in your phase 2 commercialization plan.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? I thought I saw someone else on the phone. Oh, what's in chat here? Thank you. Thanks for coming, Evgeny. All right. I guess that's all. I'll give Amanda a quick chance to jump in if you want to say anything else about the rest of AOBio, or whether you'd prefer we send out a PDF of the slides, or if you just want to do it for everyone who registers.
I have a question. Do you mind?
Oh, sure.
If I ask?
No,
It's
go right ahead,
a little bit off topic, but I just, as I was getting ready to come to this, and I was looking up Virtue Lab, and the website makes it seem like you're very climate focused. And what is the connection to bio?
Thanks. So yeah, so I should have spent more time, but I was just, you know, there's so much to digest already. So Virtue Lab is an entrepreneurial support organization, and we have a fund as well that basically is designed to help early stage startups. Way back, again, before I had any gray hair, there were 3 what Oregon funded. When they funded 3 organizations, they called them signature research centers. One was what's now OBI. They were called OTRADI at the time. One was Oregon Best, which became us, Virtue Lab. And then the third one is Materials and Nanotechnology, an institute called ONAMI in Corvallis. So all those organizations are essentially, with a little bit different tactics, trying to encourage this early stage research community. However, about 8 years ago, Virtue Lab, when we were Oregon Best, applied for and received a grant, which we've received every year since, to provide free SBIR assistance to startups. And partly because the funding was from the state of Oregon, and partly because the federal government was creating this grant, which is called the FAST, to provide SBIR assistance, we use the money from that grant to provide assistance to all startups in all industries, not just for clean tech and climate change. So some of that has included some great partnerships like the one here with OEN, with the AOBio event series. We've partnered with people at OHSU. We've done stuff with OBI at times, and I've supported companies that are resonant at OBI. So even though my expertise is lower in life science and in the agencies that I talked about, I've done probably 10 or 15 NIH proposals and about a dozen NSF proposals in life science. So I can definitely help you, but compared to like an MD or some of the other people at Oak Tree or the mentors at OBI, our services are not quite as specific to medical, but the support's totally free regardless of what industry you're in, Greg. So it's often confusing, and everyone who looks, you know, you want to look at our webpage and learn what we do, and you really have to drill into the SBIR specific stuff. All right, gosh, let me put my email in the chat again, just in case anybody didn't see it during the slide, but you can reach me through that Virtue Lab website, Greg or Michael, if you want any help. Mike, I'd be glad to do a review and critique of your SBIR, just really high level, or if you have any specific issues with, you know, submitting online in grants.gov or your registrations. So I'm happy to meet up offline.
That would be fantastic. I'll definitely take you up on that. Thank you.
Leon, I just want to reiterate, since I think I got cut off and I know we started recording this after we got started. So I just want to say thank you to you for providing the service, and to VirtuLab for also making the support available for entrepreneurs in this way. And also to OEN, it's a really, really valuable contribution and we really appreciate it.
Thanks. And we really appreciate what OEN does in the community and being able to partner here. Startups need money, and anything we can do to get it from outside the region into our ecosystem, the better it is.
Big thumbs up. For the entrepreneurs here today, I would just remind you that we have our third AO Bio session first thing tomorrow morning, which is going to be a good one. It's the what investors really want conversation. So Ann Bunnenberg, who's a really experienced bioscience sector investor, will be there, as will John Harkness, the founder of Rewire Neuro, who won the AO Tech investment last year. So he went through the process of Angel Oregon Tech, which is basically the same process as AO Bio, but it was tech generally. Interesting that a bioscience company won. So John will be there just to talk about what that due diligence process was like and what he's been able to do with the company since, and the kinds of questions he got from investors following that whole process last year. And then lastly, this wasn't really, we didn't make a big hubbub about this, but Greg Schiffman, the CFO of ABSI, will be there, who has done fundraising in several different rounds at several different companies, but obviously most recently helped ABSI go through their whole IPO process. So he'll be a great resource as well. That's all tomorrow morning.
Great. Well, good luck to the entrepreneurs and good luck on the rest of the AO Bio series. Looking forward to, Oregon kind of is in the shadow of California and Washington as far as attracting life science funding, and kudos to Amanda for trying to move the needle on bringing some of that capital into Oregon.
Show us the money.
So looking forward to seeing future events like this.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Have a great day, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Amanda.